In the quiet suburbs of Austin, Texas, Michael Harris appeared to have it all. It was early spring in 2012, and Michael had just celebrated his 45th birthday. He was a well-established attorney with a sterling reputation, known for his sharp legal mind and his ability to navigate even the most challenging cases. His work often involved high-profile clients, and his success had provided him and his family with a comfortable life. His wife, Carol, a 43-year-old high school teacher, was beloved by her students and colleagues for her kindness and dedication. Together, they had a 20-year-old son, Jake, who was attending college and was heavily involved in sports and various student organizations. The Harris family lived in a spacious home in an affluent neighborhood, a symbol of the stability and success they had achieved. To their neighbors and friends, the Harrises were the embodiment of the American dream. Michael was often seen tending to his yard on weekends, engaging in friendly conversations with the other residents. Carol was actively involved in local community events and often helped organize school functions. Jake, a star athlete, had a close-knit group of friends and was seen as a role model by his peers. The family seemed perfect, happy, thriving, and grounded in their routines. But beneath this perfect exterior, Michael Harris was hiding a dark secret. For years, he had been living a double life. Despite his outward devotion to his family, Michael had a hidden side, one that was carefully concealed from the public eye. Through anonymous dating apps, he sought out encounters with men. What had initially been a passing curiosity had evolved into a dangerous habit. Each encounter was carefully orchestrated, hotel rooms booked under false names, private messaging apps used to communicate, and secret meetings arranged in places far from his home. As the months went by, Michael found it increasingly difficult to reconcile his two worlds. His love for his family was genuine. He cared deeply for Carol and Jake, and the thought of losing them filled him with dread. But his secret desires continued to grow stronger, and he felt trapped in a cycle of guilt and temptation. Every time he met someone new, he promised himself it would be the last time. Yet he kept returning to these clandestine relationships, unable to break free from the allure. At home, Carol began to notice subtle changes in her husband. Michael, who had once been open and affectionate, was now distant and preoccupied. He frequently worked late, citing an increased workload at the law firm, and his mood would shift unpredictably. At times, he would seem irritable and distracted, barely responding to her questions. Carol's intuition told her that something was wrong. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the pressure of work, or maybe he was just going through a phase. After all, every marriage had its ups and downs. She didn't want to confront the growing distance between them, fearing that doing so would shatter the image of the happy family she had worked so hard to maintain. Jake, meanwhile, was enjoying his college life. As a student athlete, he had earned a reputation for being hardworking and focused. He shared a close bond with his father, often discussing his future and seeking his advice on career goals. But despite their relationship, Jake remained oblivious to the turmoil Michael was experiencing. His best friend Tommy was an integral part of his life. The two had met during their freshman year of college and quickly became inseparable. Tommy was charismatic, outgoing, and always the life of the party. He had a natural charm that drew people to him, and Jake considered him to be more than just a friend. He was like a brother. Together, Jake and Tommy played football, attended college parties, and shared personal stories. Jake admired Tommy's confidence and sense of humor, often joking that Tommy could get away with anything. Little did Jake know that his best friend was hiding a significant secret, one that would soon threaten to tear their friendship apart. As the spring days turned into summer, the tension in Michael's life continued to grow. The weight of his double life was becoming unbearable, and he felt himself unraveling. He knew that if his secret were ever exposed, it would destroy everything he had built: his career, his reputation, and most devastatingly, his family. Yet despite the increasing danger, he couldn't bring himself to stop. The risk, the secrecy, and the fear of being caught only heightened the thrill. Carol's suspicions continued to fester. She noticed that Michael would often receive late-night text messages, which he would hurriedly check before putting his phone down, acting as though nothing had happened. His explanations about working late or needing to travel for business were becoming more frequent and less convincing. But Carol, still clinging to the image of their perfect life, chose to ignore her doubts, hoping that whatever was troubling Michael would resolve itself. Jake remained oblivious to the brewing storm in his family. His days were filled with football practice, study sessions, and nights out with Tommy and their group of friends. He was confident that he knew everything about Tommy. Their bond was unshakable, but what Jake didn't realize was that Tommy, too, was keeping a secret, and that secret was about to come to light in the most devastating way possible. As the summer of 2012 approached, the cracks in the Harris family's facade were beginning to show. What had once seemed like an ideal life was slowly unraveling, and the secrets that had been carefully hidden for so long were on the verge of being exposed. The Harris family was about to be thrust into a nightmare they could never have imagined. In late May 2012, Jake Harris returned home from college for the summer break. The Texas heat had already settled in, and the lazy, humid days stretched out before him with the promise of relaxation. Alongside his return came an invitation extended to his best friend Tommy to stay with the family for a few days. For Jake, it was the perfect arrangement, spending time with the person he considered a brother, bonding over football games and late-night conversations. For Michael Harris, it was a nightmare unfolding right before his eyes. Michael didn't immediately recognize the name Tommy when Jake first mentioned his friend's visit. It wasn't until the moment the young man stepped into the Harris home that Michael's stomach lurched. Standing in front of him was not just Jake's best friend, but the very man with whom Michael had been having a secret, illicit affair for the past few months. Their interactions had been brief but intense. Discreet meetings in hotels, arranged through dating apps that both had used under false names. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. Tommy was not just any stranger, he was Jake's closest companion. The tension in the air was palpable from the moment Tommy and Michael locked eyes. They exchanged a fleeting glance, both immediately aware of the precarious situation they were now in. Neither man spoke about their previous encounters, but the silence between them screamed with unspoken recognition. Michael knew that everything was at risk: his career, his reputation, and most of all, his family. But he couldn't let anyone know, especially Jake and Carol. For the next few days, the Harris household became a pressure cooker of anxiety and hidden fear. Michael did his best to act normal, keeping his distance from Tommy while pretending to be the attentive father and husband. He forced himself into casual conversations with his son, but his mind was constantly racing. What if Tommy said something? What if Jake found out? Every interaction with his family became an exercise in self-control, trying to mask the dread clawing at his insides. Tommy, however, wasn't content to let things slide quietly. Realizing the power he now held over Michael, he began to subtly manipulate the situation. What had once been a passionate, secretive affair had now transformed into a leverage point. Tommy started dropping veiled comments during dinner, hints that only Michael could pick up on, designed to unsettle him. At first, the remarks were small, easy to miss by anyone else at the table. Tommy would mention how important it was to keep secrets, or how people aren't always who they seem. These words, seemingly innocent to Jake and Carol, were loaded with meaning for Michael. Each night, as the family sat down for dinner, Michael felt the weight of Tommy's words pressing down on him. His palms would sweat, and his appetite disappeared. Tommy knew exactly what he was doing, teasing Michael with the threat of exposure. Behind closed doors, Tommy became more direct. One evening, after Jake had gone to bed, Tommy confronted Michael in the hallway. His face was smug, a thin smile curling on his lips as he cornered Michael near the study. "You wouldn't want Jake to know, would you?" Tommy whispered, his voice low and menacing. "Or Carol, for that matter. You know what you'd lose." The threat was clear. Tommy wanted something, and he knew how to get it. Money, silence. Tommy didn't care. As long as he held the secret over Michael, he had control. Michael was spiraling. Every day was a struggle to maintain his composure. He had spent years building his career, his family, and his reputation, and now it could all come crashing down because of one reckless affair. Tommy's demands were growing, but it wasn't just the money that haunted Michael. It was the constant fear of what Tommy might reveal. Michael began making excuses to be away from home, claiming work was demanding more of his time. He tried to distance himself from the source of his anxiety, but Tommy's presence in the house made it impossible to escape. Carol, meanwhile, couldn't ignore the changes in her husband any longer. Michael had always been a man who prided himself on control. He managed his career, his home, and his relationships with precision. But lately that control seemed to be slipping. He was becoming distant, irritable, and unpredictable. His absences, once easily explained by work, were now too frequent and poorly justified. The man she had married seemed to be slipping away, and Carol's intuition told her that something was terribly wrong. She would catch him staring off into space, his hands trembling slightly, as if carrying some invisible burden. When she asked what was bothering him, he would dismiss her concerns, chalking it up to the pressures of work. But she knew better. There was something deeper at play, and it was tearing their marriage apart. Jake, too, began to notice odd behavior, not only from his father, but also from Tommy. His friend, usually carefree and energetic, had become more withdrawn. Tommy had always been the life of the party, but now he was frequently disappearing, making vague excuses about needing time to think. Jake, confused and concerned, tried to talk to Tommy, but every time the subject came up, Tommy would deflect, changing the conversation or leaving abruptly. It didn't help that his father, who normally was eager to talk about college life or Jake's future, seemed equally evasive. One evening as Jake sat down with his father, hoping for some fatherly advice about his own future, he brought up Tommy's strange behavior. "Dad, something's off with Tommy," Jake started, his voice filled with concern. "He's not himself lately. Have you noticed?" Michael froze, panic flashing across his face before he quickly composed himself. "He's probably just dealing with his own stuff, Jake. Everyone goes through things." But his response felt hollow, and Jake sensed there was more to it. The conversation left both men uneasy. Jake, uncertain about the changes in his friend, and Michael, terrified that his son was starting to put the pieces together. As the days dragged on, the tension in the Harris home became unbearable. Michael felt like he was walking on a tightrope, balancing precariously between two worlds, one where he was the devoted father and husband, and another where he was hiding a secret that could destroy them all. Tommy's presence was a constant reminder of the danger he was in, and every passing moment seemed to bring them closer to the point of no return. The house, once a place of comfort and security, now felt like a prison for Michael. He was a man slowly losing control, trapped by his own decisions, and haunted by the fear of what would happen when the truth finally came to light. By early June 2012, the Harris household had turned into a silent battlefield. What had started as a dangerous secret between Michael and Tommy had now morphed into something far darker. Tommy, fully aware of the power he held over Michael, had begun to exploit it. He knew that Michael, with his successful career, his family, and his reputation, would do anything to keep the affair from being exposed. This was the perfect leverage, and Tommy used it to his full advantage. It started small. One evening, Tommy casually mentioned to Michael that he was struggling with finances. Nothing too direct, just a subtle suggestion. But the implication was clear. Tommy expected money in exchange for his silence. The first time Michael gave in, it was under the guise of helping a friend of the family. He handed Tommy a few $100s, hoping it would satisfy him and buy some time to figure out how to extricate himself from this nightmare. But it didn't stop there. Tommy returned with more demands, larger amounts, more frequent payments. He began showing up unannounced at the office where Michael worked, texting cryptic messages that only heightened Michael's paranoia. "We need to talk" became a phrase Michael dreaded seeing on his phone. He would make excuses to leave work early, meeting Tommy in discreet locations to hand over cash. Each transaction chipped away at his already fragile mental state. Michael's attempts to distance himself from Tommy only made things worse. Tommy had become a specter in his life, always looming, always threatening. As the weeks went on, Tommy's demands escalated. He hinted at revealing the affair to Carol, to Jake, or even worse, to Michael's colleagues. He knew that one word about their secret would be enough to obliterate Michael's career and reputation. The threat of public humiliation hung over Michael like a sword, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped. Meanwhile, Michael's behavior at home began to deteriorate. Carol, who had always been a supportive and understanding wife, started to notice how withdrawn and erratic her husband had become. The man who had once been so confident and composed was now a shell of his former self. Michael would come home late, his eyes hollow, his face drawn with stress. He often locked himself in his study, claiming he needed to work, though Carol suspected little work was actually being done. She would sometimes hear him pacing late at night, his footsteps echoing through the quiet house. His temper flared at unexpected moments. Small, insignificant things would set him off. If Carol asked an innocent question about his day, Michael would snap, his response short and harsh. He had always been good at maintaining a facade, but now the cracks were too deep to conceal. Carol's concern deepened as the weeks dragged on. She tried to talk to him, offering comfort and understanding, but Michael would always shut her down, muttering vague excuses about stress at work. She knew he was lying. By mid-June, the tension between Michael and Tommy had reached a boiling point. Tommy's demands were no longer about money. They were about control. Tommy reveled in the power he had over Michael, pushing boundaries just to see how far he could go. One evening, while Carol and Jake were out for the evening, Tommy cornered Michael in the Harris home. His tone was different this time, darker, more insistent. "You know, it wouldn't take much for all of this to come crashing down," Tommy said, leaning in close to Michael. "One word to Jake, and your perfect life is over." Michael felt his pulse quicken, his palms slick with sweat. The walls of his once safe and secure home now felt like they were closing in on him. He tried to reason with Tommy, offering him more money, but Tommy wasn't interested in just cash anymore. He wanted full control over Michael, to manipulate him as he saw fit. He thrived on watching Michael squirm, seeing the fear in his eyes. It gave Tommy a sense of superiority, a thrill that no amount of money could satisfy. Michael's desperation grew by the day. He couldn't talk to Carol. How could he explain what was happening without destroying her? She had already noticed his increasing detachment, and the last thing he wanted was for her to uncover the truth. Michael tried to avoid Tommy, but Tommy was relentless. He showed up unannounced at odd hours, always with new demands, always with more threats. Every time Michael saw him, it felt like he was looking at the embodiment of everything that could destroy him. Carol, for her part, could no longer ignore the glaring signs that something was terribly wrong. Michael had become a stranger in his own home. He was emotionally absent, often retreating to his study for hours without explanation. When she confronted him about his distance, his responses were evasive, his eyes avoiding hers. Carol's worry turned into suspicion. She began wondering if Michael was having an affair, but the truth was far worse than anything she could have imagined. By late June, Michael's carefully constructed life was beginning to crumble. He had become paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing that Tommy would make good on his threats. His work began to suffer as well. He missed important meetings, forgot deadlines, and became increasingly erratic in his dealings with clients. His colleagues at the law firm noticed the change, but said nothing, assuming he was going through a difficult personal time. The strain between Michael, Tommy, and Carol was like a ticking time bomb, and Michael could feel it getting closer to detonation with each passing day. Every conversation with Tommy felt like a negotiation for his very life. Every moment spent with his family was haunted by the looming threat of their world collapsing around them. Michael's desperation reached new heights as he began to question how much longer he could keep this up. The stress was consuming him from the inside out. He had tried to find a way out, tried to placate Tommy, tried to salvage his family life, but it was no use. Tommy had him trapped, and Michael could see no escape. The love triangle that had once been rooted in secrecy and lust was now spiraling toward inevitable destruction. By the time July arrived, the tension in the Harris household was unbearable. The long, hot summer evenings only heightened the suffocating atmosphere inside their home. On a particularly sweltering night, Michael returned home later than usual. He had been avoiding coming home early, fearing the sight of Tommy, the person who held the key to his undoing. But this night would be different. Michael could feel it in the pit of his stomach as he pulled into the driveway. Something was off. As he entered the house, Michael immediately sensed a shift in the air. The house, usually filled with the quiet hum of evening routines, was uncharacteristically still. He moved toward the living room, where voices drifted toward him, low, tense, unfamiliar in their tone. He stepped into the doorway and saw Jake and Tommy sitting on the couch, their faces illuminated by the glow of a cell phone screen. Both men looked up at him, the air thick with something unspoken. Jake's face was a mixture of confusion and frustration. He held Tommy's phone in his hand, his brows furrowed as he scrolled through a series of text messages. "Dad, what the hell is this?" Jake's voice was tight, demanding answers. Michael's heart sank as he saw the incriminating messages on the screen. Messages he had sent to Tommy over the past few months. His affair, laid bare for his son to see. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Michael's mind raced, trying to form an explanation, a way to downplay what Jake had found. But it was too late. Tommy's expression had shifted from one of casual arrogance to something darker. He knew that the game was over. The secrecy that had allowed him to manipulate Michael was now crumbling in real time. Jake, who had been suspicious of Tommy for weeks, had accidentally stumbled upon the messages earlier that evening when Tommy's phone buzzed with a new notification. Without thinking, Jake had glanced at the screen and seen a message from an unknown number, his father's number. Curiosity piqued, he unlocked the phone, scrolling back through the conversation. What he found made his stomach drop. Intimate messages between Tommy and his father. At first, Jake thought it was some kind of sick joke, but the further he scrolled, the more damning the evidence became. Jake's mind had been reeling as he confronted Tommy, who had tried to downplay the situation, saying it wasn't what it looked like. But the messages were undeniable. They spoke of secret meetings, coded language for their affair, and references to keeping everything hidden. The betrayal that Jake felt in that moment was overwhelming. He had always seen Tommy as his best friend, a brother, but now he saw him as a snake, someone who had wormed his way into his family's life, only to exploit it. As Michael stood frozen in the doorway, Jake threw the phone down on the couch, his face flushed with anger. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't do this," Jake demanded, his voice cracking. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. What could he say? How could he explain the betrayal, the lies, the sheer devastation he had caused? Silence filled the room, heavy and damning. Tommy, sensing that the truth could no longer be avoided, leaned back on the couch, a resigned expression on his face. "I can't lie anymore, Jake," Tommy said, his voice low. "I've been involved with your dad for months." Jake's world shattered in that instant. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of the revelation. The man he had admired, his father, the man who had always taught him about integrity and loyalty, had been having an affair with his best friend. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the destruction of everything Jake believed in. For a moment, Jake was too stunned to react. His hands balled into fists, his breath quickened, and his chest tightened with a wave of fury he had never experienced before. He had trusted both of them, Tommy, his best friend, and Michael, his father. And now that trust was gone, obliterated by their selfishness. "I trusted you!" Jake screamed, his voice raw with emotion as he looked from Tommy to his father. His entire body trembled with rage. He stood up, towering over Tommy, who remained seated, his face impassive. "You betrayed me! Both of you!" Jake's words were punctuated by a shove, his hands slamming into Tommy's chest. Tommy barely had time to react before Jake lunged at him. The room erupted into chaos as the two men collided. Tommy, initially taken off guard, quickly recovered, and the two friends turned enemies began grappling in a physical fight fueled by betrayal and anger. Fists flew, furniture toppled, and the living room became a battleground. Michael, frozen at first, snapped out of his stupor and rushed forward to intervene, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. As the struggle intensified, Jake managed to land a punch that sent Tommy reeling backward. His body hit the corner of the coffee table with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything stopped. The sound of Tommy's head striking the hard surface reverberated through the room, followed by an eerie silence. Tommy lay still on the floor, his body limp, blood beginning to pool under his head. Jake stood frozen, his fists still clenched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality of what had just happened settled over him like a suffocating weight. He hadn't meant to go this far. He hadn't meant to kill him. Michael rushed to Tommy's side, his hands shaking as he tried to check for a pulse. But there was nothing. Tommy's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his life extinguished in an instant. Michael's mind raced. What had just happened? How had it come to this? Jake stood motionless, his face pale as he stared at Tommy's lifeless body. His best friend, the man he had grown up with, the man who had shared his secrets, his dreams, was dead, and it was his fault. For a moment, Michael didn't move. His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. Shock, horror, and a desperate need to protect his son. Jake looked up at him, his eyes filled with terror. "Dad, I didn't mean to. I didn't know what I was doing." Jake's voice cracked as he spoke, the guilt already eating away at him. Michael took a deep breath, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. This was a disaster, but there had to be a way out. They couldn't let this incident destroy them. His first thought was to call the police and report the accident, but then he hesitated. He imagined Jake being hauled away in handcuffs, charged with manslaughter, his life ruined. He couldn't let that happen. Not to his son. He had already destroyed so much with his own mistakes. He couldn't let Jake's life be ripped apart too. Michael knelt beside Tommy's body, checking for a pulse even though he knew it was futile. There was no sign of life. Tommy was gone, and there was nothing that could be done to bring him back. Michael stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his pants, trying to focus. His mind worked frantically, calculating their options. They had to think fast. Every minute that passed increased the risk of someone discovering what had happened. "We have to move him," Michael said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his head. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "What? Dad, no. We can't." But Michael was resolute. "Listen to me," he said, gripping Jake's shoulders, forcing him to meet his gaze. "If the police find out about this, your life is over. We can't let them find out. We have to get rid of the body." Jake's stomach churned at the words. The thought of covering up what had happened felt wrong on every level, but his mind was too clouded with fear and guilt to argue. He nodded, too stunned to resist, and the two men began the grim task of moving Tommy's body. They wrapped Tommy in a blanket, trying to contain the blood as best they could. Michael had seen enough crime scenes in his career to know they needed to be careful about leaving evidence behind. Every step they took felt like an eternity, the weight of Tommy's body a physical and emotional burden they both struggled to carry. Once they had loaded the body into the trunk of Michael's car, they drove in silence, the oppressive darkness of the Texas night pressing in around them. Michael's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing with plans and counterplans. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every detail had to be accounted for if they were going to avoid suspicion. They drove out of town, heading toward a remote area on the outskirts of Austin. Michael knew of a secluded spot in the woods, far enough from any major roads that no one would stumble upon it by accident. The silence in the car was unbearable. Jake sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his mind numb from the horror of what they were about to do. When they arrived, the forest was eerily quiet. They worked quickly, digging a shallow grave in the hard, dry Texas soil. Every shovel of dirt felt heavier than the last, the weight of their crimes sinking deeper into their consciences. The smell of the earth mixed with the faint coppery scent of blood still clinging to their clothes. Once the grave was ready, they lowered Tommy's body into it. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the shovel, helping to cover the body with dirt. The sound of the soil hitting Tommy's body was sickening, a harsh reminder of the finality of what they were doing. When the grave was finally filled, they stood in silence, staring at the freshly turned earth. It was over. But it wasn't. The act of burying the body didn't bring the relief Michael had hoped for. Instead, it left a hollow pit of dread in his chest. They might have hidden the evidence, but the truth was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. The guilt, the fear, the knowledge of what they had done, it would never leave them. As they drove back home, Jake slumped in the passenger seat, tears streaming down his face. "What have we done?" he whispered, his voice broken. Michael didn't respond. He didn't have an answer. He knew that this night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The days following the burial of Tommy's body passed in a blur for both Michael and Jake. They went through the motions of their daily lives, but the weight of their actions hung over them like a storm cloud. Michael tried to keep up appearances, going to work as usual and interacting with his colleagues. But inside, he was unraveling. Every ring of the phone, every knock on the door sent a jolt of fear through his body. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. Jake was a shell of his former self. He barely left his room, racked with guilt and consumed by nightmares of that fateful night. His friend, his brother in all but blood, was gone because of him. The burden was unbearable, but Jake held on to the only thing his father had told him after they buried the body. They had to stick to the story. They had to pretend like nothing had happened, as if Tommy had simply disappeared. It didn't take long for Tommy to be reported missing. When he failed to show up for classes and didn't respond to calls or texts, his friends grew concerned. The police were notified, and an investigation was launched. Flyers with Tommy's picture appeared around Austin, asking if anyone had seen him. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the Harris family intensified. Carol, noticing how distant and strange both Michael and Jake had become, grew more suspicious by the day. But no one could have anticipated the discovery that would soon change everything. It was early August when the police found Tommy's body. A local hiker had stumbled upon a patch of disturbed earth in the woods outside the city. At first it seemed like nothing, but when the man noticed scraps of fabric poking through the soil, he called the authorities. The police arrived and quickly realized they were dealing with a shallow grave. Within hours, the body was unearthed, and it didn't take long for investigators to confirm that it was Tommy. The news of Tommy's death sent shockwaves through the community. What had started as a missing persons case quickly turned into a homicide investigation. The once quiet suburb was now buzzing with police activity as detectives retraced Tommy's last known movements. The Harris family, who had been keeping a low profile, were now thrust into the center of the investigation. It wasn't long before the evidence started to point toward Jake. Neighbors recalled seeing Tommy at the Harris house the night he disappeared. Phone records showed multiple calls and texts between Tommy and Jake. Worse still, DNA evidence found on Tommy's body and clothing linked directly to Jake. The police began questioning him, and though Jake tried to maintain his composure, the pressure was too much. He denied everything at first, but his story was inconsistent, his alibis shaky. As the investigation closed in, Michael could see that his son was on the verge of collapse. He watched helplessly as Jake became a prime suspect in Tommy's murder. The police were relentless, and it was clear that Jake wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. Michael knew the truth was about to come crashing down on them. One evening, after yet another round of questioning by the detectives, Michael found Jake sitting in the living room, his face pale and drawn. "Dad, I can't do this anymore," Jake whispered, his voice cracking under the strain. They know I did it." Michael's heart sank. He knew Jake was right. The evidence was overwhelming, and no amount of denial or deflection would save them now. It was then that Michael made the decision that would change everything. The next morning, Michael walked into the police station, his mind made up. He couldn't let Jake take the full blame for what had happened. It was his fault, after all. His secret life, his affair with Tommy, had set this chain of events in motion. The guilt was eating him alive, and he couldn't bear to watch his son go down for a crime they had both tried to cover up. Sitting in the interrogation room, Michael took a deep breath and began to speak. He confessed everything: the affair, the fight between Jake and Tommy, the accidental death, and the decision to bury the body. He spared no detail, knowing that this was the only way to protect his son from the worst. The detectives listened in stunned silence as Michael laid bare the full extent of the tragedy. When the news of Michael's confession reached Carol, it shattered her world. She had suspected something was wrong, but the reality of her husband's betrayal, both his infidelity and his role in the cover-up of a murder, was too much to bear. The life they had built together, the family they had created, had been destroyed in a single, irreversible act. In the days following the confession, Carol packed her bags and left. She couldn't stay. The man she thought she knew had been living a lie, and the realization that he had chosen to protect their son by covering up a crime was the final blow. Her trust, her love for him, it was all gone. Michael watched helplessly as she walked out of their home, leaving him behind to face the consequences of his actions alone. In the months that followed, both Michael and Jake were tried for their respective roles in Tommy's death. Jake, charged with involuntary manslaughter, was sentenced to several years in prison. Though the court acknowledged that Tommy's death had been accidental, the cover-up and the attempts to hide the body weighed heavily against him. Jake's once promising future was now in ruins, his life forever marked by that fateful night. Michael, charged with obstruction of justice and aiding in the concealment of a body, was also sentenced to prison. His years as a respected attorney, his reputation in the community, none of it mattered anymore. He had thrown it all away in a desperate attempt to protect his son, but the price had been far too high. The Harris family, once the picture of success and stability, was now irreparably broken. The house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter was now empty, a hollow reminder of the life they had lost. Carol, unable to move past the betrayal, started a new life far away, cutting ties with the man who had destroyed everything they had built together. Michael and Jake, now separated by prison walls, lived with the knowledge that their actions had led to Tommy's death and the unraveling of their family. The secret passion that had begun in the shadows had brought them to their knees, leaving behind scars that would never heal.